Hello, and welcome. You've arrived somehow at the beginning of this mythically uneventful journey. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Which time zone have you dragged yourself through to get here? GMT, EST, JST, or something more obscure and emotionally resonant? Whether it's morning, midnight, or that strange hour when the kettle feels like your only friend, thank you for tuning in. Let's begin. It is a truth universally misquoted that Pandora opened a box. She did not. She opened a jar. A large bulbous ceramic jar, likely unglazed, possibly cracked, and almost certainly dusty. The kind of jar that would sit in the corner of a pantry, not on a pedestal. The kind of jar that would hold grain, or oil, or if one were feeling metaphorical, suffering. The original Greek word, pithos, refers to a storage vessel. Not a decorative container. Not a jewelry box. Not a treasure chest. A jar. A utilitarian object, often large enough to require 2 hands and a mild grunt. Hesiod, our earliest source, used this word with no apparent flourish. He did not describe the jar's color, nor its curvature, nor whether it had a lid that squeaked. He simply stated that Pandora had one, and that she opened it. The confusion began, as confusions often do, with a Renaissance humanist, Erasmus of Rotterdam, in the 16th century, translated pithos as pyxis, a box. Why he did this is unclear. Perhaps he preferred boxes. Perhaps he found jars unpoetic. Perhaps he was distracted by lunch. Regardless, the mistranslations stuck. And now schoolchildren everywhere imagine Pandora opening something dainty and hinged, rather than something squat and earthen. This error has persisted for centuries. It has appeared in textbooks, in paintings, in animated films. The box has become canonical, despite being entirely incorrect. Scholars have written papers about this. Long papers. Papers with footnotes. Papers that begin with phrases like, "It is worth reconsidering the vessel in question." These papers are rarely read in full. The jar, as an object, is deeply unremarkable. It does not sparkle, it does not gleam, it does not lend itself to metaphor with ease. And yet, it is the vessel chosen to contain all the evils of the world. Disease, toil, bureaucracy, possibly mildew, possibly the concept of waiting in line. These evils, once released, flew out in no particular order, like poorly alphabetized grievances. At the bottom of the jar, after everything else had escaped, was elpis, hope, or expectation, or, depending on your preferred translation, a vague sense of possibility. Scholars have debated this word extensively. Some argue that hope was a gift. Others claim it was a trap. Still others suggest that Hesiod was simply being poetic, and that the jar was never meant to be taken literally. There is no archaeological evidence of Pandora's jar. No museum has it, no excavation has unearthed it. And yet, replicas abound. They sit in gift shops, labeled Pandora's box, often filled with chocolates or bath salts. The irony is rarely acknowledged. The jar, in its original myth, was not opened out of malice. Pandora was curious. She was designed to be curious. The gods gave her charm, grace, and a mild disregard for instructions. She opened the jar not with wicked intent, but with the same impulse that leads one to shake a wrapped gift or read the last page of a novel first. The consequences were unfortunate. but the action was entirely human. And so, the myth begins, not with grandeur, but with a misunderstanding. A jar mistaken for a box. A woman blamed for curiosity. A world changed by the release of metaphors. It is, in many ways, the perfect myth to begin with. Quietly incorrect, mildly unfair, endlessly debated, and deeply boring. Pandora was not born. She was made. Not in the usual sense, not through labor or lineage, but through divine craftsmanship. She was sculpted from clay by Hephaestus, the god of fire and metallurgy, who, one imagines, approached the task with the same methodical detachment he applied to bronze helmets and ornamental buckles. Her form was said to be flawless, her purpose, less so. She was commissioned by Zeus, not out of affection, but out of irritation. Prometheus, that meddlesome titan, had recently gifted fire to humanity. A generous act, if one enjoys warmth and cooking, but a direct violation of divine protocol. Zeus, ever the fan of retaliatory symbolism, decided that if humans were going to have fire, they should also have consequences. Enter Pandora. The gods contributed to her construction like artisans at a mildly passive-aggressive potluck. Aphrodite gave her beauty, which was considered essential. Hermes gave her speech, which was considered dangerous. Athena gave her needlework, which was considered quaint. Each gift was bestowed with a kind of divine flourish, as if assembling a particularly elaborate trap. Her name, Pandora, means all-giving. A detail that has puzzled scholars for centuries. Was she generous? Was she ironic? Was the name a marketing error? Interpretations vary. Some suggest the name refers to the gifts she received. Others claim it refers to the gifts she gave, namely, suffering. Still others propose that Hesiod was simply being poetic, and that etymology should not be taken too seriously before breakfast. Pandora was then presented to Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother. Epimetheus, whose name means afterthought, accepted her without hesitation. This was, in retrospect, consistent with his branding. Prometheus had warned him not to accept gifts from Zeus, but Epimetheus, possibly distracted by her embroidery skills, ignored the advice. The myth, as Hesiod tells it, is not subtle. Pandora is framed as the origin of human misery. She opens the jar, releases the evils, and leaves humanity to cope. There is no nuance, no ambiguity, no suggestion that she was coerced or confused. She is simply curious. And curiosity, in this context, is a design flaw. Later interpretations have attempted to rehabilitate her image. Some cast her as a symbol of human inquisitiveness. Others suggest she was a victim of divine politics. Still others propose that the myth reflects ancient anxieties about women, knowledge, and the unpredictable consequences of opening things. In vase paintings, Pandora is often depicted standing beside the jar, looking vaguely concerned. Her expression is unreadable, neither guilty nor innocent, but somewhere between, "I didn't mean to," and "I wonder what's for lunch." The jar itself is usually closed, which suggests that artists preferred implication over action. Scholars have written extensively about Pandora's role in Greek thought. She is compared to Eve, to Psyche, to various figures who open things they shouldn't. The comparisons are often strained, but they persist. Academic conferences have devoted entire panels to her. Papers have been published with titles like Pandora's Jar, Vessel of Ambiguity, and Curiosity and Catastrophe. a reassessment. These papers are rarely cited outside of footnotes. The moral framing of the myth is clear. Gifts from the gods are not always gifts. Beauty can be dangerous. Speech can be misleading. Needlework, while charming, is not a defense against cosmic punishment. Pandora, as a figure, embodies the tension between appearance and consequence. She is lovely, and she is ruinous. She is generous, and she is regrettable. And yet, she is also deeply boring. Not in her construction, which was elaborate, nor in her symbolism, which is rich, but in her inevitability. She does what she is made to do. She opens the jar. The evils escape. The scholars debate. The myth persists. In this way, Pandora is less a character, and more a mechanism, a narrative device, a warning. Sculpted in clay and wrapped in metaphor. She does not evolve. She does not resist. She simply exists, beautifully and disastrously, like a well-designed spreadsheet with one fatal formula. And so we continue. Not with resolution but with repetition. The jar remains open. The evils remain loose. Pandora remains misunderstood. And hope, as we shall see, remains quietly at the bottom. At the bottom of the jar, after disease had fluttered out, after sorrow had slithered forth, after bureaucracy had tiptoed into the world wearing sandals that squeaked, there remained one final occupant. Elpis, a word that has been translated, debated, and misunderstood with the kind of scholarly enthusiasm usually reserved for ancient shopping lists. Elpis is often rendered as hope, but this translation, while popular, is not universally accepted. Some argue it means expectation, others suggest anticipation. A few propose delusion, though they tend to be invited to fewer conferences. The ambiguity is not accidental. Ancient Greek, like most languages, was fond of words that meant several things at once, depending on context, tone, and whether one had recently eaten lunch. Hesiod, our primary source, does not clarify. He simply states that Elpis remained in the jar. He does not say whether this was good. He does not say whether this was bad. He does not say whether the jar was resealed, or whether Elpis simply sat there, blinking slowly, like a metaphor waiting to be unpacked. Scholars have responded to this vagueness with predictable enthusiasm. Entire dissertations have been written on the placement of Elpis. Was it withheld from humanity, thus denying comfort? Or was it preserved, thus offering solace? Or was it simply forgotten, like a receipt at the bottom of a bag? The Stoics, ever suspicious of emotion, viewed hope as a dangerous distraction. It encouraged longing, they said. It delayed acceptance. It made people believe things might improve, which was, in their view, a tactical error. The Epicureans, by contrast, were more forgiving. They saw hope as a gentle balm, something to soothe the mind while waiting for the kettle to boil. Modern philosophers have weighed in too. Nietzsche called hope the worst of evils, which is consistent with his general mood. Camus, ever fond of absurdity, saw it as a necessary illusion. And contemporary scholars, armed with footnotes and mild caffeine dependency, continue to debate whether Elpis was a gift, a curse, or simply a narrative placeholder. The jar itself, as previously noted, has never been found. This has not stopped museums from displaying jars that resemble it. These jars are often labeled Pandoras, despite being entirely unrelated. They sit behind glass, surrounded by placards that explain the myth with cheerful inaccuracy. Visitors nod politely, take photos, and move on to the gift shop. In literary circles, Elpis has become a motif. It appears in poems, in novels, in motivational posters. It is invoked during speeches, quoted during crises, and printed on mugs. Its origin, however, remains stubbornly dull, a word at the bottom of a jar, left behind after everything else had escaped. Some scholars suggest that Elpis was meant to be ambiguous, that Hesiod, in his wisdom or indifference, wanted readers to decide for themselves. Others propose that he simply ran out of lines. Still others argue that the myth was never about hope at all, but about the inevitability of misunderstanding. And so, we are left with a jar that was not a box, a jar that contained evils, a jar that contained hope. A jar that was opened by a woman who was sculpted, gifted, and blamed. A jar that has become a metaphor, a mistranslation, and a mildly disappointing museum exhibit. Hope remains. Not because it is powerful, but because it is persistent. It lingers quietly, like background music in a waiting room. It does not solve anything. It does not change anything. But it is there, at the bottom, blinking slowly, waiting to be interpreted. And as we close this chapter, we do so not with resolution, but with repetition. The jar remains open, the scholars remain divided, Pandora remains misunderstood, and hope, as always, remains quietly behind. Medusa, as she is commonly known, is often reduced to a face with snakes, a face that petrifies, a face that appears on shields, coins, and the occasional novelty t-shirt. But before she was a face, she was a figure. And before she was a figure, she was a footnote, one of 3 Gorgon sisters, and arguably the least understood. The earliest depictions of Medusa are not flattering. On archaic pottery, she is rendered with bulging eyes, a protruding tongue, and a grimace that suggests either rage or indigestion. Her hair, if one can call it that, is a tangle of serpents, though early artists seemed unsure whether these were literal snakes or simply a bad perm. The aesthetic is not consistent. Some portray her with wings, others with tusks, a few with what appear to be boar-like features, though this may be artistic license or a misunderstanding of the brief. Her sisters Stheno and Euryale are rarely discussed. They were immortal. Medusa was not. This detail, while seemingly minor, has fueled centuries of academic debate. Why was Medusa mortal? Was it a narrative convenience, a symbolic gesture, a clerical error? Scholars have proposed all 3, often in the same paragraph. The myth, as it evolved, became increasingly dramatic. Medusa, once a monstrous figure, was reimagined as a tragic one. Ovid, ever fond of embellishment, claimed she was once beautiful, a priestess of Athena no less, who was assaulted by Poseidon in a temple. Athena, in a move that has puzzled ethicists and literary critics alike, punished Medusa by transforming her into a creature so hideous that her gaze turned men to stone. The logic of this punishment is unclear. The symbolism, however, is rich. Modern interpretations have leaned into this tragedy. Medusa has become a symbol of violated innocence, of female rage, of misunderstood power. She has appeared in feminist essays, in psychological treatises, in art installations involving mirrors and serpentine motifs. Her face, once feared, is now reclaimed, though still, it must be said, deeply unsettling. In ancient Greece, her image was used apotropaically, that is, to ward off evil. Her face appeared on shields, on doorways, on coins. The idea was that her terrifying visage would frighten away misfortune. This raises questions about the aesthetic preferences of ancient Greeks, who apparently believed that the best way to deter evil was to confront it with something even worse. The Gorgonian, as her face came to be known, was stylized over time. The bulging eyes softened, the tongue receded, the snakes became decorative. By the classical period, Medusa's face was almost serene, still unsettling, but in a way that suggested quiet menace rather than active threat. It was the kind of face one might see on a coin and think, "Ah yes, that's mildly alarming." Scholars have catalogued these changes with the kind of meticulousness usually reserved for butterfly wings. They have traced the evolution of Medusa's iconography from Corinthian pottery to Roman mosaics. They have debated whether her gaze was literal or metaphorical. They have speculated on the psychological impact of being turned to stone, though most agree it would be brief. Medusa's story intersects with that of Perseus, the hero who beheaded her with the help of divine accessories: a mirrored shield, winged sandals, a cap of invisibility. The myth reads like a shopping list from a particularly well-stocked deity. Perseus, guided by Athena, approached Medusa while she slept, a detail that has prompted ethical discussions in classrooms and awkward silences in lecture halls. After her death, Medusa's head continued to function. It was used by Perseus to defeat enemies, to petrify sea monsters, and eventually to decorate Athena's shield. The logistics of this are rarely addressed. Did the head require refrigeration? Was it stored in a pouch? Did it retain consciousness? Scholars have wisely avoided these questions. And so Medusa remains, misunderstood, misrepresented, and mildly terrifying. Her face, once monstrous, has become symbolic. Her story, once simple, has become layered. Her myth, once cautionary, has become a canvas for interpretation. In this way, she is not unlike Pandora. Both were punished for actions that were arguably not their fault. Both became symbols of feminine danger. Both have been reinterpreted, reclaimed, and repurposed. And both, it must be said, are deeply boring when discussed at length. Which we shall now do. In the shadow of Medusa's serpentine fame stand two figures who, despite their immortality, have been largely ignored. Stheno and Euryale, the elder Gorgon sisters, are mentioned in passing, referenced in genealogies, and occasionally sketched on pottery with the kind of vague enthusiasm reserved for background foliage. Their names appear in Hesiod's Theogony, nestled between more prominent deities, like guests at a symposium who arrived early and were never offered wine. Stheno, whose name means strength, and Euryale, meaning wide-stepping, were, according to most sources, born of Phorcys and Ceto, primordial sea deities with a fondness for spawning monsters. The sisters were immortal, unlike Medusa, and shared her general aesthetic: wings, tusks, serpentine hair, and a gaze that could petrify. Though whether their gaze actually did petrify is a matter of some debate. Some scholars suggest only Medusa had that particular talent. Others argue it was a family trait. Still others propose that the whole petrification motif was metaphorical, though they tend to be politely ignored at conferences. The sisters' immortality is often cited as the reason Perseus targeted Medusa. She was the only one who could be killed. This detail, while narratively convenient, has prompted a number of interpretive tangents. Was Medusa's mortality symbolic of vulnerability? Was it a literary device to justify heroism? Was it simply bad luck? The texts do not say. The scholars, however, do. At length. In artistic representations, Stheno and Euryale are indistinct. They appear beside Medusa, often smaller, often less detailed, often looking vaguely surprised. Their features are similar: wide eyes, open mouths, serpentine motifs, but their personalities are not explored. They do not speak. They do not act. They do not, as far as the myths suggest, do much of anything. They are present, but not participatory, like footnotes in a myth that was already too long. This absence of narrative agency has led to a kind of mythic neglect. While Medusa has been reimagined, reinterpreted, and reclaimed, her sisters remain static. They are not tragic, they are not symbolic, they are not in any meaningful sense interesting, and yet they are there, immortal, unchanging, and quietly enduring. Some scholars have attempted to revive interest in the sisters. Articles have been published with titles like Stheno and Euryale, The Forgotten Gorgons, and Wide Stepping Through Mythic Margins. These articles are well researched, lightly footnoted, and rarely cited. They propose that the sisters represent constancy, or resistance, or the overlooked aspects of feminine power. These interpretations are thoughtful, but largely speculative. In iconography, the sisters are sometimes indistinguishable from Medusa. This has led to confusion in museum catalogues, where labels such as Gorgon, possibly Medusa, are common. Occasionally, a curator will attempt to differentiate them based on wing placement or snake density, but these efforts are often abandoned in favor of more popular exhibits. The sisters' immortality, while mythically significant, is narratively inconvenient. They cannot be defeated, they cannot be transformed, they cannot in any meaningful way evolve. This makes them poor candidates for heroism, tragedy, or redemption. They are, in essence, mythic constants, unchanging, unchallenged, and largely unexamined. And yet, their presence lingers, in the background of pottery, in the margins of texts, in the quiet corners of myth where nothing much happens. They are reminders that not all figures are central, that not all stories are told, that sometimes immortality is less a gift than a narrative cul-de-sac. In this way, Stheno and Euryale are not unlike the concept of Elpis, hope left behind, unexplored, ambiguous. They endure without explanation. They exist without elaboration. They are, in the most literal sense, boring. And in the context of this story, that makes them perfect. After her death, if one can call decapitation by a semi-divine teenager death, in the mythological sense, Medusa's head did not rest. It did not decompose. It did not fade into obscurity. Instead, it embarked on a second career. A posthumous tour, if you will. A kind of mythic encore. Perseus, having beheaded Medusa with the help of a mirrored shield, winged sandals, and a cap of invisibility, all of which raise logistical questions best left unanswered, carried the head with him. Not in a respectful urn, not in a ceremonial pouch, but, according to most sources, in a sack. A simple, functional sack. Possibly leather, possibly woven, possibly enchanted to prevent accidental petrification, though this detail is rarely clarified. The head retained its power. It could still turn beings to stone. This was useful, narratively speaking. Perseus used it to defeat various adversaries, including Phineus, who had the misfortune of being both his rival and poorly positioned during a dinner party. He also used it to petrify a sea monster, rescue Andromeda, and settle minor disputes with alarming finality. The ethics of this are rarely discussed. Was the head sentient? Did it retain awareness? Did it object to being weaponized? Ancient texts are silent on the matter. Modern scholars, when pressed, tend to change the subject. The notion of a severed head functioning as a portable deterrent is, admittedly, difficult to unpack without veering into uncomfortable territory. Eventually, Perseus gifted the head to Athena. This was considered an honor. Athena affixed it to her shield, the aegis, where it served as both decoration and defense. The shield, already formidable, now bore the image of a woman punished for being assaulted, beheaded for being monstrous, and displayed for being useful. The symbolism is layered. The discomfort, palpable. In artistic representations, the head on the aegis varies. Sometimes it is fierce, sometimes serene. Sometimes it resembles a decorative brooch, which raises questions about scale. The snakes are often stylized, curling in symmetrical patterns that suggest either aesthetic refinement or a lack of interest in realism. The face, once grotesque, becomes iconic, a motif, a brand. Over time, Medusa's head appeared on coins, on armor, on architectural friezes. It was used to ward off evil, to signal divine protection, to decorate fountains. The logic of this is tenuous. One might question the efficacy of a petrifying image rendered in stone. One might also question the taste of placing a severed head above a doorway. But ancient aesthetics were, as ever, unapologetically bold. Scholars have catalogued these appearances with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for rare beetles. They have traced the Gorgonion's evolution from archaic grimace to classical calm. They have debated whether the image retained its original meaning, or became a generic symbol of power. They have published articles with titles like Medusa's Afterlife, Iconography and Ambiguity, which are cited primarily by other articles with similar titles. The persistence of Medusa's head in art and literature suggests a kind of mythic inertia. She was useful, she was memorable. She was, despite her lack of agency, remarkably versatile. Her head became a tool, a symbol, a motif. It traveled further than she ever did. It endured longer than her story. It became, in a sense, more famous than she was. And yet it remained misunderstood. The head was feared, admired, commodified. But the woman behind it, the priestess, the victim, the sister, was forgotten. Her story was simplified, her complexity flattened, her tragedy repurposed. In this way, Medusa's head is not unlike Pandora's jar. Both were opened, both released consequences, both became symbols, and both, when examined closely, reveal a quiet discomfort beneath their mythic utility. And so we close this chapter, not with resolution, but with repetition. The head remains on the shield, the scholars remain divided, the myth remains iconic, and Medusa, as ever, remains quietly decapitated. Ariadne's thread is famous. It is invoked in classrooms, in crossword clues, in essays about narrative structure. It is used as a metaphor for logic, for guidance, for the delicate art of not getting lost. But before it was a metaphor, it was a literal thread, a length of spun fiber, possibly wool, possibly linen, possibly dyed with something vaguely vegetal. It was handed to Theseus, who used it to navigate a labyrinth. And then, like so many useful things, it was forgotten. The labyrinth itself was designed by Daedalus, a man whose architectural philosophy can best be described as unnecessarily complicated. It was built to house the Minotaur, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull, or possibly the other way around, depending on the vase. The Minotaur was the result of divine meddling, bovine attraction, and a series of decisions that scholars prefer not to explain in detail. Ariadne, daughter of King Minos, was tasked with overseeing the labyrinth's logistics. She was not consulted about its design. She was not asked whether she believed in its purpose. She was simply expected to manage its operations, which included feeding the Minotaur, and ensuring that Athenian youths were deposited inside at regular intervals. It was, by all accounts, a thankless role. Then came Theseus. Handsome, heroic, mildly overconfident, he arrived in Crete with the intention of slaying the Minotaur and ending the tribute of sacrificial youths. Ariadne, for reasons that remain unclear, decided to help him. She gave him a thread. Not a sword, not a map, not a divine blessing. A thread. A single, unassuming length of fiber. The thread, according to most versions, was tied to the entrance of the labyrinth. Theseus unspooled it as he ventured inward, slayed the Minotaur, details vary, and followed the thread back out. It was, in essence, a primitive GPS. No signal required. No updates needed, just a continuous line, leading from confusion to clarity. Scholars have interpreted the thread in various ways, as a symbol of logic, as a metaphor for narrative coherence, as a representation of feminine guidance. Some suggest it reflects the linearity of myth. Others propose it represents the fragility of memory. A few argue that it was simply a practical solution to a spatial problem. The thread itself is never described in detail. Was it thick? Was it frayed? Did it tangle? Did Theseus trip over it? The texts are silent. The poets, uninterested. The artists, vague. And yet, the thread persists. Mentioned in passing, illustrated in fragments, referenced in lectures with the kind of reverence usually reserved for more substantial objects. Ariadne's role in this story is often minimized. She is the giver of the thread, the facilitator of escape, the woman left behind. After helping Theseus, she was abandoned on the island of Naxos. The reasons for this vary. Some say Theseus forgot her. Others claim he was instructed by the gods. A few suggest he was simply not very nice. Regardless, Ariadne was left to contemplate her choices, her thread, and the nature of heroism. Later myths attempt to redeem her. Dionysus, the god of wine and theatrical ambiguity, found her and made her his wife. This transition, from abandoned mortal to divine consort, is presented with minimal explanation. It is unclear whether Ariadne was consulted. It is unclear whether she approved. It is unclear whether she ever mentioned the thread again. In this way, Ariadne's story is not unlike Medusa's. Both women facilitated male success. Both were punished or forgotten. Both were later reimagined as symbols. And both, when examined closely, reveal a quiet discomfort beneath their mythic utility. The thread, meanwhile, remains iconic. It is used in literature, in psychology, in urban planning. It is invoked whenever someone needs to find their way out of something confusing. And yet, its origin, a young woman, a labyrinth, a bull-headed prisoner, is rarely discussed in full. And so, we begin to unravel, not with urgency, but with repetition. The thread stretches, the scholars speculate, the labyrinth remains. And Ariadne, as ever, waits quietly at the entrance. The labyrinth, as it appears in myth, is often mistaken for a maze. This is a common error. A maze, technically speaking, contains choices, forks, dead ends, the possibility of error. A labyrinth, by contrast, is unicursal, one path, winding, inevitable, without deviation. The distinction is academic, pedantic, and largely ignored by storytellers, architects, and most people who have better things to do. Daedalus, the architect of the labyrinth, is credited with its design. He was a craftsman of considerable skill, known for building wings, statues, and moral dilemmas. The labyrinth was commissioned by King Minos to house the Minotaur, a creature born of divine mischief, bovine romance, and a series of decisions that scholars prefer not to explain in polite company. The structure itself is never described in detail. Was it underground? Was it above ground? Was it circular, rectilinear? Did it contain frescoes? Did it smell of damp stone and regret? The texts are vague, the poets, evasive, the vase painters, inconsistent, and yet, the labyrinth persists, mentioned in passing, illustrated in fragments, referenced in lectures, with the kind of reverence usually reserved for more tangible buildings. Some scholars suggest the labyrinth was metaphorical, a symbol of confusion, a representation of the human psyche, a narrative device designed to delay resolution. Others propose it was based on actual architecture, perhaps the palace at Knossos, with its winding corridors and inexplicable storage rooms. Still others argue that the entire concept was invented to justify the existence of Ariadne's thread. The Minotaur, housed within, is similarly underdescribed. He is said to be half man, half bull, though the proportions vary. Some depictions show a man with a bull's head. Others show a bull with human limbs. A few show something that resembles a disgruntled centaur with branding issues. His diet is said to consist of Athenian youths, though the logistics of this are rarely addressed. Did he cook? Did he season? Did he dine alone? The myths are silent. Theseus, upon entering the labyrinth, is said to have slain the Minotaur. The method is unclear. Some say he used a sword, others suggest brute strength. A few imply he simply annoyed the creature into submission. The details are not the focus. The thread is. And yet, the labyrinth remains central. It is the setting, the challenge, the metaphor. It represents confusion, danger, and the need for guidance. It is invoked in literature, in psychology, in urban planning. It is used to describe bureaucracies, relationships, and the experience of assembling flat-pack furniture. In academic circles, the labyrinth has been analyzed extensively. Papers have been written on its symbolic geometry, diagrams have been drawn, models have been built, conferences have been held. The conclusions vary, but the tone is consistent, thoughtful, speculative, and mildly soporific. Daedalus, the architect, is rarely blamed for the confusion. He is praised for his ingenuity, admired for his craftsmanship, and occasionally pitied for his parenting. His son Icarus will feature in a later chapter. For now, Daedalus remains a figure of quiet competence, a man who built a structure so convoluted that even he struggled to escape it. In this way, the labyrinth is not unlike Medusa's gaze or Pandora's jar. It is a mythic mechanism, designed to contain, to confuse, to provoke interpretation. It is not a place one visits, it is a place one discusses, slowly, repetitively, with diagrams. And so we continue, not with clarity, but with winding speculation. The corridors stretch, the scholars meander, the Minotaur waits, and Ariadne, as ever, stands quietly at the entrance, holding a thread that may or may not lead anywhere. Ariadne, having handed over the thread, having watched Theseus descend into the labyrinth, having waited patiently for the sound of victory or at least a polite scream, was rewarded not with gratitude, nor with ceremony, nor even with a commemorative amphora. She was rewarded with abandonment. The island of Naxos, where she was left, is described in ancient texts with minimal enthusiasm. It was rocky, it was quiet, it had goats. Theseus, having completed his heroic task, sailed away, without explanation, without farewell, and one suspects without a clear understanding of what thank you meant. The reasons for this departure vary. Some say he was instructed by the gods. Others claim he forgot. A few suggest he was simply not very good at relationships. Ariadne's reaction is not recorded. No lament, no monologue, no dramatic gesture involving waves or sandals. She simply remains, on the shore, in the myth, in the background. Her thread, once central, is now irrelevant. Her role, once pivotal, is now complete. She is, in narrative terms, surplus. This abandonment has puzzled scholars. Was it symbolic? Was it a narrative necessity? Was it a reflection of ancient attitudes toward helpful women? Papers have been written. Panels convened. Footnotes assembled. The consensus, as usual, is elusive. Later myths attempt to redeem her. Dionysus, god of wine, revelry, and interpretive ambiguity, arrives. He finds Ariadne, he marries her, he elevates her to divinity. The transition is abrupt. The logistics unclear. Was she consulted? Was there a ceremony? Did she retain her thread? The texts do not say. Dionysus as a figure is difficult to summarize. He is divine, but erratic, joyful, but unsettling. His arrival in Ariadne's story is often framed as salvation, though the details suggest something more theatrical. He appears, he gestures, he transforms. Ariadne becomes his consort, his queen, his mythic accessory. Her previous narrative is overwritten, her abandonment reframed as prelude. In art, Ariadne is often depicted reclining, on a beach, on a couch, on a cloud. Her posture suggests either relaxation or resignation. Dionysus stands nearby, holding a cup, wearing a crown of ivy, looking vaguely pleased. The scene is serene, symbolic, and mildly confusing. Scholars have interpreted this union in various ways. As a metaphor for transcendence, as a reward for loyalty, as a narrative patch for an awkward ending. Some suggest Ariadne's elevation reflects the mythic tendency to resolve discomfort with divinity. Others propose it was simply a convenient way to recycle a character. Her thread, notably, is never mentioned again. It does not appear in her divine iconography. It is not referenced in hymns. It is not woven into her new role. It is, like so many useful things, quietly discarded. In this way, Ariadne is not unlike Medusa or Pandora. Each begins with agency. Each facilitates a turning point. Each is then punished, forgotten, or transformed. Their stories are linear, until they aren't. Their roles are central, until they drift. Their symbols, jar, head, thread, persist, while they themselves fade. And so we close this chapter, not with resolution, but with quiet elevation. Ariadne remains. abandoned, reclaimed, reimagined. The thread remains, unspooled, unmentioned, unresolved. And the labyrinth, as ever, waits silently beneath the myth. In the vast and vine-laced landscape of Greek mythology, few creatures are as consistently misrepresented, and as consistently underwhelming, as the satyr, half man, half goat, or sometimes half horse depending on the region and the artist's mood. The satyr is typically depicted as a creature of revelry. He drinks, he dances, he plays the aulos, a double-reeded instrument that sounds like two oboes arguing. He chases nymphs, often unsuccessfully. He appears in plays, in pottery, in cautionary tales about moderation. But not all satyrs were enthusiastic participants in Dionysian festivities. 1. According to a fragmentary and rarely cited source, possibly a marginal note in a lost dithyramb, refused to dance. He was invited. He was encouraged. He was offered wine, figs, and a front-row seat to a chorus of maenads. But he declined. Politely. Firmly. Repeatedly. This satyr, whose name may have been something like Brigmos or Snorthos, the manuscripts are unclear, preferred solitude. He lived at the edge of the grove, near a stream that babbled with the kind of indifference only water can muster. He spent his days reclining on moss, chewing bark, and contemplating the curvature of amphorae. He was, in essence, a rustic introvert. His refusal to dance was not ideological. He did not oppose Dionysus. He did not critique the choreography. He simply found the whole affair exhausting. The music was loud. The wine was tepid. The nymphs were chatty. The other satyrs were overly enthusiastic. Brigmos preferred silence, or at least the kind of ambient noise produced by distant cicadas and the occasional goat. This behavior puzzled his peers. Satyrs by definition were supposed to revel. They were embodiments of excess, of impulse, of rustic abandon. To abstain was to defy one's nature. To sit quietly was to invite speculation. Was Brigmos cursed? Was he melancholic? Was he, as one dithyrambic commentator suggested, simply not very good at dancing? Scholars have debated this satyr's significance with the kind of seriousness that makes one question the allocation of academic funding. Some propose he represents resistance to social conformity. Others suggest he is a symbol of moderation within excess. A few argue he was invented by a poet who had run out of adjectives. In vase paintings, Brigmos does not appear, or if he does, he is indistinguishable from other satyrs. Horned, bearded, possibly holding a wineskin. His refusal to dance is not depicted. His solitude is not illustrated. His bark chewing is not immortalized. He remains, as ever, a footnote. And yet his myth persists, quietly, in the margins, in the pauses between revels, in the scholarly footnotes that begin with, "It is worth noting," and end with, "though the evidence is inconclusive." In this way, Brigmos is not unlike Ariadne. Both facilitated mythic moments. Both were sidelined. Both were reinterpreted. And both, when examined closely, reveal a quiet discomfort beneath their symbolic roles. The satyr who refused to dance reminds us that not all myths are loud. Not all revels are universal. Not all creatures conform. Some prefer moss. Some prefer silence. Some prefer to watch the wine ferment slowly, without interruption. And so we begin this chapter, not with music, but with quiet defiance. The satyr reclines. The scholars speculate. The grove remains. And Dionysus, as ever, dances elsewhere. The Dionysian festival, as it appears in myth and fragmentary civic records, was not so much an event as a phenomenon. It began ostensibly as a celebration of wine, fertility, and theatrical innovation. It ended, more often than not, with someone asleep in a vineyard, someone else reciting poetry to a goat, and a third person attempting to invent democracy using only a wineskin and a lyre. The satyrs, naturally, were central to this affair. They danced, they drank, they played instruments with names that sound like sneezes: aulos, tympanon, crotalon. They wore masks, or didn't. They chased nymphs, or pretended to. They recited dithyrambs, choral hymns to Dionysus that were either deeply moving or deeply confusing, depending on one's proximity to the wine. The dithyramb itself is a genre that defies summary. It is musical but not melodic, poetic but not structured. It involves repetition, invocation, and the kind of rhythmic chanting that makes one question whether time is passing or simply looping. Scholars have attempted to reconstruct dithyrambs from surviving fragments, most of which read like someone trying to remember a song they heard once while tipsy. The festival, held in rural groves and urban theaters alike, was both sacred and chaotic. Offerings were made, libations poured, plays performed, animals sacrificed, costumes donned, boundaries blurred. The line between worship and revelry was not so much crossed as danced upon, repeatedly, by satyrs wearing questionable footwear. One particular festival, recorded in a fragmentary inscription from a village whose name has been lost to erosion and mild indifference, involved a satyr chorus performing a dithyramb, entitled Ode to the Vine That Grew Sideways. The performance was said to last 3 hours, involve 17 masks, and conclude with a communal nap. The audience, according to the inscription, was moved, confused, and mildly damp. Scholars have debated the function of these festivals, with a kind of slow intensity that suggests they are trying to avoid grading papers. Some argue the rituals were cathartic, releasing social tension through structured chaos. Others propose they were pedagogical, teaching moral lessons through exaggerated behavior. A few suggest they were simply fun, though this interpretation is considered academically suspect. The satyrs as mythic figures embody this ambiguity. They are divine but not serious, sacred but not solemn. They represent impulse, instinct, and the rural imagination. They are not heroes, they are not villains. They are, in essence, mythic background noise, always present, rarely central, occasionally profound. In vase paintings, satyrs are depicted mid-revel. They leap. They grin. They hold instruments at improbable angles. Their anatomy is inconsistent. Their expressions, exaggerated. Their presence, unmistakable. And yet, they are rarely the focus. They are decorative, supplemental, the mythic equivalent of a footnote with hooves. The festival in its entirety is a study in excess. It begins with intention, it ends with ambiguity. It is structured, then unstructured. It is sacred, then soggy. It is, in many ways, the perfect metaphor for myth itself, beginning with clarity, ending with speculation, and filled with interpretive wine. In this way, the Dionysian festival is not unlike the labyrinth, or the jar, or the severed head. It is a mythic mechanism, designed to provoke, to confuse, to endure. It is not a place one visits, it is a place one discusses, slowly, repetitively, with footnotes. And so, we continue, not with resolution, but with revelry. The satyrs dance, the scholars interpret, the dithyramb loops, and Dionysus, as ever, smiles faintly from beneath a crown of ivy. Dionysus, god of wine, theatre, vegetation, and interpretive confusion, is a figure who resists summary. He is divine but erratic, joyful but unsettling, central but elusive. He appears in myths, in rituals, in plays, in footnotes. He is worshipped, feared, misunderstood, and occasionally mispronounced. His birth, like much of his myth, is complicated. He was born twice. First to Semele, a mortal woman who asked to see Zeus in his true form, a request that ended poorly. Then again, from Zeus's thigh, which raises anatomical questions that scholars prefer not to address before lunch. This dual birth has been interpreted as symbolic of transformation, of rebirth, of divine improvisation. It has also been described, less poetically, as narratively convenient. Dionysus's childhood is equally ambiguous. He was hidden, disguised, raised by nymphs, possibly educated by goats. He traveled widely, India, Thrace, the underworld, though the itinerary is vague and the travel documentation non-existent. He gathered followers, satyrs, maenads, poets, people who enjoyed shouting in unison. His cult spread, not through conquest but through confusion. In art, Dionysus is depicted with ivy, with grapes, with a faint smile that suggests he knows something you don't. He wears robes, or doesn't. He holds a thyrsus, a staff topped with pinecone and vine, which is either symbolic or decorative. He is surrounded by revelers, by animals, by symbols that defy categorization. His posture is relaxed, his gaze indirect, his presence unmistakable. Scholars have attempted to define Dionysus with the kind of slow determination usually reserved for assembling ancient furniture. They describe him as a god of liminality, existing between states, between roles, between definitions. He is male but fluid, civilized but wild, joyful but tragic. He is invoked in weddings, in funerals, in theatrical premieres. He is, in essence, mythic ambiguity personified. His rituals reflect this. The Dionysia, both rural and urban, involved processions, performances, sacrifices, and the kind of structured chaos that makes one question whether the schedule was ever finalized. Plays were performed, tragedies, comedies, satydramas. Wine was consumed, masks were worn, boundaries were blurred. The god was honored, though the criteria for success were never clearly defined. In literature, Dionysus appears as both protagonist and disruption. In Euripides the Bacchae, he is charming, terrifying, divine, petty. He punishes disbelief with theatrical precision. He inspires ecstasy, then regret. He is both the cause and the consequence. The play ends with confusion, with transformation, with the kind of interpretive ambiguity that prompts scholars to write papers entitled Ambivalence in Ivy, Reassessing Dionysian Duality. His relationship with Ariadne, as discussed previously, is similarly vague. He finds her, he marries her, he elevates her. The details are sparse, the motivations unclear, the symbolism rich. Was she a reward? A consort? A metaphor? The texts do not say. The scholars, however, do. At length. Dionysus's refusal to explain himself is not accidental. It is thematic. He embodies contradiction. He resists clarity. He invites interpretation, then undermines it. He is, in many ways, the perfect subject for mythic scholarship, endlessly debatable, perpetually unresolved, and mildly exhausting. In this way, Dionysus is not unlike the labyrinth, the jar, the thread, the severed head. He is a mythic mechanism designed to provoke, to confuse, to endure. He is not a god one worships with certainty. He is a god one discusses, slowly, repetitively, with footnotes. And so we close this chapter, not with definition, but with diffusion. Dionysus remains, smiling faintly, crowned with ivy, surrounded by satyrs, who may or may not be dancing. The scholars remain, debating, diagramming, dithering. And the myth, as ever, remains quietly unresolved. In the mythic contest for the patronage of Athens, two gods presented gifts. Poseidon, lord of the sea, offered a saltwater spring, an impressive gesture, if one enjoys brine. Athena, goddess of wisdom, offered an olive tree, a modest plant, a quiet crop, a symbol of peace, prosperity, and the kind of agricultural stability that rarely inspires epic poetry. The citizens, or perhaps their mythical representatives, chose the tree. This decision has puzzled scholars. Salt water, after all, is dramatic. It crashes, it foams. It inspires metaphors. Olive trees, by contrast, grow slowly. They require pruning. They produce fruit that must be cured before consumption. They are, in essence, the bureaucrats of the botanical world. And yet, the olive tree prevailed. Athena became the city's patron. Poseidon, mildly offended, receded into the background. The spring remained, though it was largely ignored. The tree, meanwhile, became central, planted on the Acropolis, referenced in hymns, depicted in art, and discussed in lectures, with the kind of reverence usually reserved for more flamboyant flora. The tree itself, according to myth, was planted by Athena with a gesture, possibly a tap of her spear, possibly a divine sigh. It grew instantly, or slowly, depending on the source. It bore fruit, or didn't. It was tended by priests, or goats. The details vary. The symbolism, however, is consistent. Olive trees represent peace. They represent endurance. They represent the kind of slow, deliberate growth that appeals to civilizations interested in not collapsing. In Athens, the tree became a civic emblem. It appeared on coins, on seals, on pottery. It was referenced in laws, in rituals, in mildly confusing agricultural festivals. Scholars have interpreted the tree's victory as a metaphor for civic values. Athena's gift was practical, sustainable, symbolic of wisdom and restraint. Poseidon's, while dramatic, was less useful. Salt water, after all, is not drinkable. It corrodes. It inspires poetry, but not infrastructure. This interpretation, while popular, is not universal. Some argue the myth reflects political propaganda, Athens aligning itself with wisdom over force. Others suggest it was a narrative justification for the city's name. A few propose that the entire contest was invented retroactively to explain why the city wasn't called Poseidonia. In art, the olive tree is depicted with minimal flair. It is small, it is leafy. It is often overshadowed by Athena herself, who stands beside it, armored, poised, and mildly intimidating. The tree does not sparkle. It does not glow. It does not demand attention. It simply exists, quietly symbolic, quietly useful, quietly mythic. The tree's location on the Acropolis has been debated. Was it literal? Was it symbolic? Was it replanted after various invasions, fires, and architectural renovations? Archaeologists have searched. Botanists have speculated. Tour guides have gestured vaguely. The original tree, if it ever existed, is gone. But its myth remains, rooted in civic identity, in agricultural metaphor, in the kind of slow symbolism that resists erosion. In this way, Athena's olive tree is not unlike Ariadne's thread, or Medusa's head, or Pandora's jar. It is a mythic object, simple, symbolic, endlessly interpreted. It does not move, it does not speak, it does not demand attention, but it endures, quietly, persistently, botanically. And so, we begin this chapter, not with thunder but with foliage. The tree grows, the scholars speculate, the salt water recedes, and Athena as ever remains quietly victorious. The olive, as a fruit, is not immediately rewarding. It is bitter, it is firm, it resists consumption. It must be cured, soaked, salted, fermented, or otherwise persuaded to become edible. It is, in culinary terms, a fruit that requires negotiation. And yet it became central to Greek agriculture, cuisine, economy, and myth. Athena's gift, the olive tree, was not flashy, it did not sparkle, it did not sing. It did not produce instant gratification, it produced olives. Slowly. Seasonally. In modest quantities. The tree itself grew with deliberate restraint, gnarled, persistent, quietly photogenic. Its leaves were silvery, its bark, textured, its roots, stubborn. It was, in essence, a botanical embodiment of civic patience. The cultivation of olives in ancient Greece was a process that invited repetition. Trees were planted in rows, or clusters, or wherever the soil permitted. They were pruned with care, watered with hope, and harvested with the kind of slow enthusiasm that suggests a deep respect for delayed outcomes. The fruit, once gathered, was sorted, pressed, cured, and stored. The oil extracted was used for cooking, lighting, anointing, and occasionally for philosophical metaphors. Scholars have written extensively about olive agriculture. They have described the tools, wooden rakes, stone presses, ceramic amphorae. They have catalogued the techniques, cold pressing, warm pressing, pressing while reciting hymns to Demeter. They have debated the symbolism. Was the olive a sign of peace, of prosperity, of divine favor, or simply a convenient crop? In civic rituals, olives were offered to gods, to victors, to bureaucrats. Olive wreaths crowned athletes. Olive oil anointed statues. Olive branches were extended as gestures of diplomacy. Though the logistics of this gesture, how one holds a branch while negotiating trade agreements, are rarely illustrated. The olive's role in myth is understated but persistent. It appears in Homer, in Hesiod, in the quiet corners of tragedy. It is referenced in similes, like an olive tree in bloom, like an olive crushed underfoot, like an olive that has been discussed at length in a symposium. It is used to mark boundaries, to signal fertility, to decorate pottery with the kind of leafy repetition that suggests both reverence and a lack of alternative motifs. In art, olives are depicted with minimal flair. They appear as dots, as ovals, as clusters. They are held by goddesses, by farmers, by children, who may or may not understand their economic significance. They are painted in black, in red, in the kind of muted tones that suggest both realism and artistic fatigue. The patience required to cultivate olives has been interpreted as a civic virtue. Athens, by choosing Athena's gift, chose endurance over spectacle. They chose slow growth over immediate drama. They chose a fruit that required effort, interpretation, and a mild tolerance for bitterness. This interpretation, while poetic, is not universally accepted. Some scholars argue the myth was retrofitted to justify agricultural practices. Others suggest it was a metaphor for political stability. A few propose it was simply a story told to children, who asked why the city wasn't named after a more exciting god. In this way, the olive is not unlike the jar, the thread, the head, the labyrinth. It is a mythic object, simple, symbolic, endlessly interpreted. It does not demand attention, it demands patience. And so, we continue, not with harvest, but with hesitation. The fruit ripens. The scholars speculate. The oil is pressed. And Athena, as ever, remains quietly agricultural. Athena, unlike many of her divine peers, did not shout. She did not storm. She did not arrive with thunder, with spectacle, with a retinue of winged creatures demanding attention. She arrived with a tree. A modest, leafy offering. A gesture of civic intent, a symbol of restraint. In the contest for Athens, she did not argue, she did not threaten, she did not summon waves or earthquakes. Poseidon did all of that. He struck the ground with his trident. He summoned a spring, salty, dramatic, mildly impractical. Athena, by contrast, tapped the earth. A tree emerged. It did not sparkle, it did not sing, it simply grew. This contrast has been interpreted endlessly. Poseidon, force, impulse, spectacle. Athena, wisdom, patience, utility. The citizens, or their mythic proxies, chose the tree. They chose quiet over noise. They chose foliage over foam. Athena's demeanor in myth is consistently restrained. She advises, she strategizes, she intervenes with precision. She does not seduce, she does not revel, she does not wander. She is, in essence, the deity of well-organized spreadsheets and politely worded memos. Her olive tree, planted on the Acropolis, became a symbol of civic identity. It was tended by priests. It was referenced in laws. It was protected by ritual. Its existence was both literal and metaphorical, rooted in soil and in symbolism. In art, Athena is depicted beside the tree. She stands upright. She wears armor. She holds a spear. The tree, by comparison, leans gently. Its leaves flutter. Its fruit, if present, is understated. Scholars have examined this pairing with the kind of slow enthusiasm that suggests a fondness for metaphor. They describe the tree as a symbol of peace, of prosperity, of civic virtue. They describe Athena as the embodiment of rational governance. They describe the myth as a narrative endorsement of agricultural policy. Some argue the tree represents Athens itself, resilient, cultivated, occasionally pruned. Others suggest it reflects the city's aspirations, order, wisdom, mild superiority. A few propose it was simply a convenient way to explain the presence of olive groves near the agora. Athena's quiet planting stands in contrast to other divine gestures. Zeus throws lightning, Apollo sings, Dionysus dances, Athena plants. She does not demand applause. She does not require interpretation. She simply offers a tree. This restraint has made her a favorite among scholars who prefer footnotes to fireworks. Her myths are structured, her interventions strategic, her symbolism layered but legible. In this way, Athena is not unlike Ariadne, or Medusa or Pandora. She facilitates. She endures. She is reinterpreted, but never overwhelmed. Her tree, like her myth, grows slowly, rooted in civic soil, branching into academic speculation. And so, we close this chapter, not with drama, but with foliage. The tree remains, the scholars annotate, the salt water recedes, and Athena, as ever, remains quietly victorious. The myth of Leda begins, as many Greek myths do, with a transformation and a questionable decision. Zeus, king of the gods, sovereign of thunder and frequent practitioner of disguise, chose to approach Leda not as himself, not as a bull, not as a shower of gold, but as a swan, a large white feathered swan, possibly mute, possibly vocal, possibly anatomically confusing. Leda, queen of Sparta, wife of Tyndareus, mother of future complications, was bathing, or walking, or reclining. The sources vary. The setting is pastoral, the mood ambiguous. The swan descended, graceful, deliberate, mythically inconvenient. What followed is described in euphemisms: embraced, visited, lay with. The language is vague, poetic, and deeply evasive. Scholars have debated the nature of this encounter with the kind of slow intensity that suggests discomfort. Was it consensual? Was it symbolic? Was it a metaphor for divine intrusion into mortal life? Was the swan literal, or allegorical, or simply a narrative device designed to provoke interpretive essays? The earliest sources do not clarify. Ovid, ever fond of transformation, describes the scene with lyrical ambiguity. Euripides, if he addressed it, did so obliquely. Later poets embellished, painters illustrated, sculptors sculpted. The swan, once a bird, became a motif, graceful, unsettling, and mildly absurd. In art, the scene is rendered with varying degrees of discretion. Leda reclines. The swan approaches. Sometimes she resists. Sometimes she embraces. Sometimes the swan is anatomically plausible. Sometimes it is not. The feathers are detailed. The expressions, unreadable. The mood, somewhere between pastoral serenity and mythic intrusion. The offspring of this encounter are equally ambiguous. Leda laid eggs. This detail, while biologically improbable, is mythically accepted. From these eggs emerged Helen, later of Troy, and the Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux. Or perhaps only Helen and Pollux. Or perhaps all four. Or perhaps none. The parentage is disputed. Some are mortal, some divine. Some both. The eggs, meanwhile, are rarely discussed in detail. Scholars have catalogued the variations with the kind of meticulousness usually reserved for stamp collections. They have traced the lineage. They have debated the symbolism. They have speculated on the implications of egg-laying in human anatomy. They have published papers with titles like Feathers and Fate, Reassessing Leda's Encounter, and Avian Intrusion in Hellenic Myth. The swan as a symbol is complex. It represents grace, it represents deception, it glides, it conceals, it transforms. In mythology, it is both divine and disruptive. In ornithology, it is less so. Zeus's choice of disguise has prompted interpretive tangents. Why a swan? Why not a hawk, a dove, a more plausible suitor? Was it symbolic of purity, of seduction, of absurdity? Was it a commentary on divine detachment? Was it simply a narrative flourish? In this way, the swan is not unlike the jar, the thread, the labyrinth, the severed head. It is a mythic mechanism, designed to provoke, to confuse, to endure. It is not a bird one observes, it is a bird one discusses, slowly, repetitively, with footnotes. And so we begin this chapter, not with clarity, but with feathers. The swan descends, the scholars speculate, the eggs are laid, and leader, as ever, remains quietly mythic. From the swan's embrace, or intrusion, or visitation, or metaphor, came eggs. This detail, while biologically implausible, is mythically accepted. Leda, a mortal woman, laid 2 eggs. Or 1. Or possibly 4. The sources vary, the poets disagree. The vase painters, as usual, are unhelpfully inconsistent. From these eggs emerged children: Helen, Castor, Pollux, Clytemnestra, or perhaps only Helen and Pollux, or perhaps Castor and Clytemnestra, or perhaps all 4, though not all from Zeus. Some were divine, some were mortal, some were both. The genealogical math is, at best, interpretive. Helen, later of Troy, is the most famous. She is described as radiant, irresistible, mythically inconvenient. Her beauty launched ships, inspired epics, and prompted diplomatic breakdowns. She is said to be the daughter of Zeus, born from the egg touched by divinity. Her lineage is cited in speeches, in treaties, in footnotes. Her role in myth is central, though her agency is often debated. Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, are twins, or half-twins, or twin-adjacent. Castor is mortal. Pollux is divine. They share a bond so profound that when Castor dies, Pollux petitions Zeus to share his immortality. The result is a celestial compromise. They alternate days in Olympus and Hades. This arrangement has been interpreted as symbolic of duality, of brotherhood, of mythic time-sharing. Clytemnestra, less discussed in this context, becomes central in later myths. She marries Agamemnon, she plots, she acts. Her story unfolds in tragedy, in vengeance, in interpretive essays about gender and agency. Her parentage is often attributed to Tyndareus, Leda's mortal husband. She is not born of the swan, she is born of narrative necessity. The eggs themselves are rarely described. Were they large? Were they warm? Were they laid in a nest, in a palace, in a metaphor? Did they crack with ceremony? Did they require incubation? Did anyone take notes? In art, the eggs appear occasionally. They are oval, they are smooth. They are held by Leda, or by nymphs, or by confused attendants. The children emerge fully formed or partially or symbolically. The scenes are serene, surreal, and mildly unsettling. Scholars have catalogued these variations with the kind of slow precision usually reserved for ancient coinage. They have traced the lineage. They have debated the implications of divine paternity. They have speculated on the symbolic meaning of twinship, of egg-laying, of mythic biology. Some propose the eggs represent transformation. Others suggest they symbolize divine intrusion into mortal life. A few argue they were simply a poetic flourish, an attempt to reconcile incompatible genealogies with a single overform metaphor. The children, once hatched, diverge. Helen becomes legend. Castor and Pollux become stars, literally, as the constellation Gemini. Clytemnestra becomes tragedy. Their origins remain ambiguous. Their roles, mythically significant. In this way, the children of Leda are not unlike the olive, the thread, the jar, the head. They emerge from mythic mechanisms, simple, symbolic, endlessly interpreted. They do not resolve, they recur. And so, we continue, not with clarity, but with lineage. The eggs crack, the scholars annotate, the myths diverge, and Leda, as ever, remains quietly maternal. Leda, Queen of Sparta, mother of mythic complications, appears in the story of the swan, but rarely speaks. She is central, but silent. She is depicted, but not quoted. She is interpreted, but not consulted. The myth, as preserved in poetry, in art, in fragmentary scholia, offers no record of her voice. She is approached. She is embraced. She is transformed into a vessel for divine offspring. But her thoughts, her reactions, her agency, remain unrecorded. This absence has prompted slow, scholarly concern. Was Leda complicit? Was she coerced? Was she confused? Was the swan a symbol of seduction, of violation, of divine inevitability? Was the myth a metaphor for powerlessness, for transformation, for mythic intrusion? The texts do not say. Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, describes the encounter with lyrical detachment. Later poets embellish but rarely clarify. The swan remains central. Leda remains peripheral. In visual art, Leda is rendered with varying degrees of agency. She reclines, she resists, she embraces. Her posture is ambiguous. Her expression, unreadable. The swan, by contrast, is often animated, wings spread, neck curved, gaze intent. Painters from antiquity to the Renaissance have revisited the scene. Some depict it as pastoral, some as erotic, some as surreal. The feathers are detailed, the skin, luminous, the mood, interpretively unstable. Scholars have catalogued these images with the kind of slow precision usually reserved for architectural ruins. They note the positioning, they analyze the gaze. They speculate on the symbolism of feathers, of eggs, of reclining queens. Some propose that Leda's silence reflects mythic norms, women as vessels, as symbols, as narrative catalysts. Others argue it invites reinterpretation, modern empathy projected onto ancient ambiguity. A few suggest the myth was never meant to be coherent, only evocative. In feminist readings, Leda becomes a figure of resistance. Her silence is not absence, but erasure. Her role is not passive, but overwritten. Her myth becomes a canvas for reclamation, for reinterpretation, for slow academic rebalancing. In psychoanalytic readings, the swan is a symbol of intrusion, of transformation, of the unconscious. Leda becomes the dreamer, the dreamed, the dream. The myth becomes a metaphor for desire, for repression, for mythic ambiguity. In structuralist readings, the myth is a binary, divine/mortal, male/female, speech/silence. The swan disrupts, Leda absorbs, the structure persists. And yet in all these readings, Leda herself remains elusive. She is central but undefined. She is mythic but unvoiced. She is interpreted but never asked. In this way, Leda is not unlike Pandora, or Ariadne, or Medusa. Each begins with presence. Each facilitates mythic consequence. Each is transformed, reimagined, reframed. Each is discussed, slowly, repetitively with footnotes. And so we close this chapter, not with resolution, but with recognition. Leda remains, reclining, silent, surrounded by feathers. The swan remains, symbolic, unsettling, mythically persistent. The scholars remain, debating, diagramming, dithering. And the myth, as ever, remains quietly unresolved. Sisyphus, king of Ephyra, occasional trickster, and full-time inconvenience to the gods, was condemned to a punishment so repetitive, so monotonous, so structurally perfect, that it has become a metaphor for everything from bureaucratic labor to existential despair. His task? To roll a stone uphill, a large stone, a round stone, a stone that, upon reaching the summit, would inevitably roll back down. This punishment, described in Homeric fragments and later embellished by poets, philosophers, and mildly exhausted undergraduates, is notable for its simplicity. There is no fire, no torment, no screaming chorus, just a man, a hill, a stone, and the quiet inevitability of repetition. The myth begins, as many do, with defiance. Sisyphus angered the gods. He revealed divine secrets. He tricked Thanatos, the personification of death. He chained him, temporarily halting mortality. He escaped the underworld, twice. He manipulated ritual, delayed fate, and generally behaved like someone who had read the fine print of divine contracts. The gods, unimpressed, responded with a punishment that was not violent, but tedious. They did not strike him down. They did not transform him into a shrub. They assigned him a task that could be completed, but never concluded. The stone itself is rarely described in detail. Was it smooth? Was it jagged? Did it glisten in the sun? Did it groan as it rolled? Was it symbolic of burden, of futility, of mythic inertia? In art, the scene is rendered with quiet drama. Sisyphus strains. His muscles tense, the stone looms, the hill curves. The moment is frozen, mid-effort, mid-failure, mid-metaphor. Scholars have catalogued these depictions with the kind of slow enthusiasm usually reserved for sediment layers. They note the posture, they analyze the incline. They speculate on the diameter of the stone. They publish essays with titles like Repetition and Resistance, Sisyphus in Late Archaic Vase Painting, and The Geometry of Futility, Topographical Symbolism in Mythic Punishment. Philosophers predictably have seized upon the myth. Albert Camus, in his essay The Myth of Sisyphus, declared the figure absurd, but heroic. He argued that the struggle itself was meaningful. That Sisyphus, aware of his fate, could find dignity in defiance. That the stone, though futile, became a symbol of conscious rebellion. This interpretation has been debated, footnoted, and quietly questioned. Was Sisyphus truly aware? Did he reflect? Did he philosophize between ascents? Or did he simply push, endlessly, without pause, without thought, without metaphor? In psychological readings, the myth becomes a model of labor, of routine, of burnout. Sisyphus is the office worker, the caregiver, the student revising the same paragraph. The stone is the inbox, the laundry, the unread email. The hill is Monday. In structuralist readings, the myth is binary: effort/failure, ascent/descent, hope/disappointment. The cycle persists, the meaning deferred. In literary readings, the myth is rhythm: a beat, a loop, a narrative that resists climax. It is not a story one tells, it is a story one repeats. And yet, Sisyphus remains. He does not collapse, he does not abandon the task, he rolls, he returns, he resumes. In this way Sisyphus is not unlike Ariadne, or Medusa, or Pandora, or Leda. Each is caught in a cycle, each is interpreted, reinterpreted, reframed. Each becomes a symbol, simple, enduring, quietly exhausting. And so we begin this chapter, not with resolution, but with repetition. The stone rolls, the scholars speculate, the hill remains, and Sisyphus, as ever, remains quietly persistent. The hill in Sisyphus's myth is not described, its slope is implied, its surface unmentioned, its altitude speculative, and yet it persists, central, silent and mythically immovable. It is not a mountain, it is not a mound, it is not a metaphor for ambition, though it has been interpreted as such. It is simply a hill, a gradient, a refusal. Sisyphus pushes the stone upward. The hill resists. The summit recedes. The descent begins. The cycle resumes. Scholars have speculated on the hill's incline with the kind of slow precision usually reserved for ancient irrigation systems. Was it steep? Was it gradual? Did it curve? Was it symmetrical? Some propose the hill represents time, linear, cyclical, indifferent. Others suggest it symbolizes effort, unrewarded, unrelenting, quietly absurd. A few argue it reflects divine punishment, tailored to psychological erosion, rather than physical torment. In topographical studies of myth, the hill is a rare constant. Unlike labyrinths, which twist. Unlike rivers, which flow. Unlike jars, which open. The hill remains. It does not change. It does not yield. In visual art, the hill is rendered with minimal flair. It slopes, it looms, it frames the stone, it dwarfs the man. Its surface is smooth, or rocky, or undefined. Painters depict Sisyphus mid-ascent, his posture strained, his gaze fixed, the stone precarious, the hill indifferent. In literary tellings, the hill becomes a character. It resists, it resets, it refuses to flatten. Camus, in his philosophical essay, does not describe the hill. He focuses on the man, on the moment of descent, on the consciousness of futility. The hill in this reading is background, necessary, but unexamined. In psychological readings, the hill is the obstacle, the recurring challenge, the Monday morning, the inbox, the unread email, the laundry that regenerates. In theological readings, the hill is judgment, not fire, not brimstone, but repetition, a punishment of persistence. In structuralist readings, the hill is binary, up/down, effort/failure, hope/disappointment. The stone rolls, the hill remains. And yet, the hill is never named, never measured, never mapped. It is not a place one visits, it is a place one endures. Some scholars have attempted to locate the hill, in Thessaly, in the Peloponnese, in metaphor. None have succeeded. The hill, like the myth, resists resolution. It is not a destination, it is a condition. In this way, the hill is not unlike the labyrinth, the thread, the jar, the olive tree. It is a mythic mechanism, simple, symbolic, endlessly interpreted. It does not move, it does not speak, it does not resolve. And so, we continue, not with ascent, but with repetition. The hill slopes, the scholars speculate, the stone rolls, and Sisyphus as ever remains quietly persistent. Sisyphus, condemned to roll a stone uphill for eternity, is often described as a figure of futility. But futility, like most mythic concepts, is interpretive. He does not scream. He does not collapse. He does not negotiate. He pushes. The myth, preserved in fragments and embellished by philosophers, offers no dialogue. Sisyphus does not speak. He does not reflect aloud. He does not ask for reprieve. He simply resumes. This silence has prompted centuries of speculation. Was he resigned? Was he defiant? Was he aware of the absurdity? Did he find rhythm in repetition? Did he, as Camus suggests, imagine himself happy? Camus' interpretation, published in 1942, reframed the myth. He saw Sisyphus not as a victim, but as a rebel, not as a sufferer, but as a thinker, not as a man crushed by repetition, but as one who embraced it. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart, Camus wrote. This line has been quoted in classrooms, in essays, in motivational posters, with questionable font choices. Scholars have responded with slow enthusiasm. Some agree, some dissent, some footnote. They debate whether Sisyphus had consciousness, or merely endurance, whether his punishment was psychological, or purely kinetic. In literary readings, Sisyphus becomes a rhythm, a beat, a loop, a narrative that resists climax. He is not a hero, he is not a villain, he is a verb. In psychological readings, he is labor, he is routine, he is the worker, the parent, the student, the caregiver. He is the one who resumes, who persists, who does not expect applause. In theological readings, he is judgment, not fire, not torment, but repetition, a punishment of persistence. In existential readings, he is freedom, he chooses to push, he owns the task, he transforms burden into identity. In art, Sisyphus is rendered mid-effort, his muscles tense, his brow furrows, the stone looms, the hill curves. The moment is frozen, between ascent and descent, between effort and inevitability. Rarely is he depicted resting. Rarely is he shown reflecting. He is always pushing. Always returning, always beginning again. Some scholars have speculated on his internal monologue. Did he count steps? Did he name the stone? Did he imagine alternate hills? Did he compose poetry in his mind line by line between ascents? There is no evidence, only interpretation, only repetition. In this way, Sisyphus is not unlike Ariadne, or Medusa, or Pandora, or Leda. Each is caught in a cycle, each is interpreted, reinterpreted, reframed. Each becomes a symbol, simple, enduring, quietly exhausting. And so, we close this chapter, not with triumph but with persistence. The stone rolls, the hill remains. The scholars annotate. And Sisyphus, as ever, remains quietly pushing. Echo, a nymph of the forest, of the hills, of the spaces between mythic events, was known for her voice, not her song, not her speech, but her repetition. She could not initiate, she could only respond, she could only echo. This condition was not congenital, it was imposed, a punishment, a consequence of verbosity. Echo, according to Ovid and other poets who enjoyed assigning elaborate consequences to minor infractions, had once distracted Hera. She spoke. She delayed. She filled the air with words, clever, winding, irrelevant. while Zeus, ever elusive, escaped elsewhere. Hera, unimpressed, responded with linguistic precision. She did not silence Echo. She limited her. She allowed her only repetition. Only the last words spoken to her. Only fragments. This punishment has been interpreted with the kind of slow intensity usually reserved for ancient grammar. Was it symbolic of female speech? Of narrative marginalization? Of the echo chamber of mythic consequence? Echo, once loquacious, became reactive. She wondered, she listened, she repeated. Then came Narcissus, beautiful, indifferent, mythically self-involved. Echo saw him, desired him, attempted communication. But her speech, fragmented, failed. She could not declare. She could only repeat. Narcissus, hearing his own words returned, was confused. He searched, he dismissed, he rejected. Echo, humiliated, faded, not dramatically, not with thunder, but slowly. Her body dissolved, her voice remained. She became sound, she became repetition, she became the phenomenon that bears her name. In art, echo is rarely depicted. She is not central, she is not dramatic, she is background, a whisper, a motif. In literature, she is a device, a mechanism, a metaphor for longing, for loss, for the failure of communication. Scholars have catalogued her appearances with the kind of quiet reverence usually reserved for footnotes. They note her speech patterns. They analyze her syntax. They speculate on the psychological implications of repetition. Some propose she represents unrequited love. Others suggest she symbolizes the limits of language. A few argue she is a cautionary tale about verbosity. In feminist readings, Echo becomes a figure of silencing. Her punishment is not physical but linguistic. She is denied agency, she is denied initiation, she is reduced to response. In acoustic theory, echo is literal, a reflection of sound, a delay, a repetition that fades. In psychoanalytic readings, she is the echo of desire, of rejection, of identity lost in repetition. And yet echo persists. She is heard in caves, in canyons, in myth, in metaphor. In this way, echo is not unlike Ariadne, or Leda, or Pandora. She begins with presence, she ends with absence. She is interpreted, reinterpreted, reframed. And so, we begin this chapter, not with speech, but with repetition. Echo listens, echo responds, echo fades. And the myth, as ever, remains quietly resonant. Narcissus, son of the river god Hephaestus and the nymph Liriope, was known throughout the mythic landscape not for his deeds, nor for his wisdom, nor for any particular act of heroism or defiance, but rather for his appearance, an aesthetic so arresting, so symmetrical, so mythically inconvenient, that it prompted admiration from mortals, nymphs, and eventually from himself. His beauty, described in terms that suggest both divine craftsmanship and narrative foreshadowing, was not merely physical, but symbolic, a mirror held up to the concept of desire itself, polished to the point of abstraction. The myth, as preserved most famously by Ovid in his Metamorphoses, unfolds not with action but with observation, not with conflict but with fixation. As Narcissus, wandering through a forest that seems designed more for metaphor than for ecology, comes upon a pool of water so still, so clear, so unnaturally reflective, that it functions less as a natural feature, and more as a mythic device, an optical trap laid by narrative inevitability. He leans in not to drink, not to bathe, not to admire the landscape, but to gaze. And in gazing, he sees a face that he does not recognize as his own, because recognition, in myth, is always delayed, always distorted, always refracted through longing. What follows is not a romance, nor a tragedy, nor a cautionary tale in the conventional sense, but a slow unraveling of identity through reflection, as Narcissus becomes enamored, not with another, not with Echo, who lingers nearby repeating fragments of his speech like a linguistic shadow, but with the image in the water, an image that does not speak, does not move, does not reciprocate, but simply remains, perfectly still, perfectly silent, perfectly silent, perfectly unattainable. He reaches out, and the image vanishes. He waits, and it returns. He speaks and hears only echo. He desires, and is denied, not by rejection, but by physics. Scholars have interpreted this moment with the kind of slow, deliberate enthusiasm that suggests both admiration and exhaustion, tracing the myth through psychological theory, through literary symbolism, through philosophical abstraction, each reading layering new meaning onto the surface of the pool, until the water itself becomes opaque with interpretation. Narcissus in these readings is not merely vain, not merely foolish, not merely tragic, but emblematic of the human condition, of the desire to know oneself, to love oneself, to escape oneself, and the impossibility of doing all three simultaneously. In psychoanalytic theory, Narcissus becomes the archetype of self-absorption, of narcissism in its clinical form, though the myth predates the diagnosis by centuries, and resists reduction to pathology. In literary theory, he is the reader, the writer, the character trapped in a loop of self-reference, unable to distinguish between reality and representation. In philosophical readings, he is the subject encountering the object, the self encountering the mirror, the consciousness encountering its own limitations. And in feminist readings, he is the man who cannot hear the woman, who cannot see beyond his own image, who reduces echo to a voice without agency, a presence without presence. The pool, meanwhile, becomes a character in its own right, a surface that reflects but does not reveal, that invites but does not yield, that holds the image but not the substance. It is not a body of water, but a metaphor for perception, for illusion, for the distance between appearance and reality. It does not ripple unless disturbed. It does not speak unless spoken to. It does not resolve unless abandoned. And Narcissus, unable to abandon it, unable to look away, unable to reconcile the image with the self, remains fixed, physically, emotionally, mythically, until he fades, not with drama, not with violence, but with quiet dissolution. He dies, or transforms, or disappears, depending on the version, and in his place grows a flower, delicate, symmetrical, reflective, a botanical echo of the boy who could not stop looking. In this way, Narcissus is not unlike Sisyphus, or Ariadne, or Leda, or Pandora. Each is caught in a loop, a gaze, a gesture that repeats. Each is interpreted, reinterpreted, reframed. Each becomes a symbol, simple, enduring, quietly exhausting. And so, we continue, not with resolution, but with reflection. The pool remains, the scholars speculate, the flower blooms, and Narcissus, as ever, remains quietly transfixed. When Narcissus finally faded, whether through hunger, heartbreak, or the slow erosion of selfhood brought on by prolonged exposure to his own reflection, he did not vanish entirely, nor did he ascend, nor was he buried with ceremony or lamentation. Instead, he transformed, or was transformed or was said to have transformed, depending on the source and the interpretive generosity of the storyteller, into a flower, delicate, symmetrical, pale, and quietly persistent. The narcissus, as it came to be known, bloomed where he had once knelt, or gazed, or dissolved, its petals arranged with the kind of botanical precision that invites metaphor, but resists memory. The flower, unlike the boy, does not speak, it does not gaze, it does not reflect, it does not remember the pool, the voice, the gaze, the longing. It simply grows, seasonally, cyclically, indifferently, emerging from soil that has long ceased to care about mythic consequence. It is admired, occasionally cultivated, occasionally ignored. It appears in poetry, in gardens, in taxonomies. It is named for Narcissus, but it does not mourn him. It does not echo him. It does not preserve him. It replaces him. This transformation from boy to bloom, from gaze to petal, from obsession to ornament, has prompted centuries of interpretive speculation, with scholars drifting slowly through botanical texts, poetic fragments, and philosophical essays in search of meaning that may never have been intended. Was the flower a reward, a punishment, a memorial, a metaphor? Was it chosen for its shape, its color, its seasonal rhythm? Did it bloom once, or always? Did it bloom alone, or among others? Did it remember? In literary readings, the flower becomes a symbol of beauty without awareness, of form without substance, of the aesthetic stripped of the self. It is admired but not known. It is named but not understood. It is the final stage of mythic abstraction, where the character dissolves, and only the symbol remains. In psychoanalytic readings, the flower is the residue of narcissism, the lingering trace of self-love that has lost its subject. It is the unconscious blooming into visibility, the desire that outlives the desirer. It is the symptom, not the cause. In ecological readings, the flower is simply a flower, native to certain regions, blooming in spring, pollinated by insects who have never read Ovid. It is catalogued, classified, cultivated. Its mythic origin is noted, but not required. In philosophical readings, the flower is the final gesture of forgetting. Narcissus, who could not look away, is replaced by a bloom that does not look at all. The gaze becomes petal, the reflection becomes root, the obsession becomes seasonal. And Echo, who once repeated his words, who once lingered nearby, who once tried to speak, is left with nothing to echo. The boy is gone, the voice is gone. The pool remains perhaps, but the sound has faded. She is not transformed, she is not memorialized, she is not named in a flower. She is left in the margins, in the silence, in the footnotes. In this way, the narcissus is not unlike the olive tree, the thread, the jar, the labyrinth, the stone. It is a mythic object, simple, symbolic, endlessly interpreted. It does not resolve the story, it replaces it. It blooms, not with memory, but with absence. And so, we close this chapter, not with remembrance, but with forgetting. The flower grows, the scholars speculate, the pool reflects nothing. And Narcissus, as ever, remains quietly replaced. Orpheus, son of the muse Calliope, and either the river god Euagris or Apollo himself, depending on which poet one consults and how much metaphor they're willing to tolerate, was not a hero in the conventional sense. He did not slay monsters, nor conquer cities, nor engage in feats of athleticism that required divine intervention, or commemorative pottery. Instead, he played music, on a lyre strung with strings that seemed to hum with the memory of rivers, of wind, of grief, and he sang, not to impress, not to seduce, but to remember, to plead, to delay the inevitable. His songs, according to mythic consensus and the kind of poetic exaggeration that scholars have learned to annotate with cautious footnotes, could move trees, could tame wild beasts, could persuade stones to weep and rivers to pause mid-current. His voice, described as both divine and human, both mournful and irresistible, was said to soften the hearts of gods and monsters alike. And yet, when Eurydice died, bitten by a snake, or claimed by fate, or simply removed from the narrative with the kind of abruptness that suggests editorial fatigue, Orpheus's music did not prevent her descent into the underworld. It did not reverse time, it did not rewrite the rules. Instead, it delayed them. Orpheus descended, not heroically, not defiantly, but musically, into the realm of Hades, where shadows linger and myths converge, not to conquer death, but to negotiate with it. He sang, and the underworld listened. Cerberus, the three-headed guardian, ceased growling. The Furies wept. Persephone, queen of shadows, remembered spring. Even Hades, who rarely indulged in sentiment, was moved, not by argument, but by melody, by the shape of grief rendered in sound. And so, a bargain was struck. Eurydice could return. She could follow Orpheus back to the world of light, of breath, of narrative continuity. But he must not look back. Not until they had both emerged. Not until the journey was complete. Not until trust had been proven. This condition, simple in phrasing but mythically complex, has been interpreted with the kind of slow, deliberate intensity that suggests both admiration and exhaustion. Was it a test? A trap? A metaphor for faith, for patience, for the impossibility of certainty? Did Hades intend for Orpheus to fail, or did he offer a genuine chance, knowing that the human mind, when paired with grief, cannot help but turn? Orpheus walked, Eurydice followed. The path was silent, the shadows receded, the music ceased, and somewhere near the threshold, near the edge of myth and memory, Orpheus turned. He looked. He broke the condition. And Eurydice, who had followed without speaking, without questioning, without confirming her presence, vanished. Again, not with drama, not with protest, but with the quiet inevitability of mythic consequence. In literary readings, this moment becomes the fulcrum of the myth, the pivot between hope and loss, between music and silence, between presence and absence. Orpheus, who could move the world with song, could not resist the urge to confirm, to verify, to see. His gaze, like Narcissus's, becomes the undoing. His doubt, like Pandora's curiosity, becomes the catalyst. In philosophical readings, the turning is a failure of trust. Orpheus cannot believe without seeing. He cannot love without proof. He cannot wait without certainty. The myth becomes a meditation on the limits of faith, on the fragility of hope, on the human need for reassurance. In psychological readings, the turning is inevitable. Grief demands confirmation. Love demands presence. The absence of sound, of voice, of touch, becomes unbearable. Orpheus turns not because he doubts Eurydice, but because he cannot bear the silence. In feminist readings, Eurydice becomes the passive figure, led, silenced, erased. She does not speak, she does not choose. She is retrieved, then lost, then forgotten. The myth becomes a study in narrative imbalance. in the erasure of female agency, in the quiet disappearance of the one who was never asked. And in musical readings the myth becomes a lament, a song that begins with hope, rises with persuasion, and ends with silence. The lyre, once vibrant, becomes mute. The voice, once persuasive, becomes solitary. The music, once powerful, becomes memory. In this way, Orpheus is not unlike Sisyphus, or Narcissus, or Ariadne. Each begins with intention. Each ends with repetition. Each is interpreted, reinterpreted, reframed. Each becomes a symbol, simple, enduring, quietly exhausting. And so, we begin this chapter, not with triumph, but with turning. The path fades, the scholars speculate, the music stops, and Orpheus, as ever, remains quietly alone. Eurydice, whose name is spoken often but whose voice is never heard, occupies a peculiar space in the mythic architecture of Orpheus's descent, not as a character with agency, nor as a participant in negotiation, nor even as a witness to her own fate, but as a figure defined entirely by absence, by silence, by the slow erosion of presence into narrative necessity. She dies early, quickly, without elaboration, bitten by a snake, or claimed by fate, or removed from the story with the kind of editorial brevity that suggests she was never meant to linger, and from that moment forward, she exists only as a goal, a shadow, a reason for Orpheus to sing. She does not speak in the underworld, she does not plead, she does not question the bargain, she does not confirm her presence as she follows Orpheus up the winding path toward daylight. She is silent, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but structurally, as if the myth itself has decided that her voice would only complicate the rhythm of grief. And when Orpheus turns, when he breaks the condition, when he looks back and sees her for the first time since her death, she does not cry out, does not protest, does not forgive. She simply vanishes, again, and finally. This silence, so complete, so deliberate, has prompted generations of scholars to lean into interpretive discomfort, tracing Eurydice's absence not as a flaw in the myth, but as its defining feature, its central tension, its quiet indictment of narrative imbalance. In literary readings, she becomes the passive object of desire, the silent muse, the woman who is loved but not known, retrieved but not heard, mourned but not remembered in her own terms. Her silence is not poetic, it is structural, imposed by a tradition that privileges the journey of the hero over the presence of the beloved. In feminist readings, Eurydice's erasure becomes a case study in mythic marginalization, a reminder that even in stories of love and loss, the female figure is often reduced to a plot device, a symbol of absence, a reason for male action. She is not asked whether she wishes to return. She is not given a voice in the bargain. She is not allowed to speak when the condition is broken. Her silence is not a choice. It is a condition of the narrative itself. In philosophical readings, her silence becomes a metaphor for unknowability, for the limits of empathy, for the impossibility of truly retrieving what has been lost. Orpheus sings, but he does not listen. He descends, but he does not ask. He turns, but he does not wait. Eurydice, in this reading, is not merely absent. She is unknowable, unreachable, irretrievable, not because she is unwilling, but because the structure of the myth does not allow her to be anything else. In psychoanalytic readings, Eurydice becomes the projection of grief, the silent echo of longing, the figure who exists only in the mind of the mourner. She is not a person, but a memory. Not a companion, but a shadow. Her silence is not resistance. It is the inevitable consequence of being loved only in absence. And in musical readings, she is the note that is never played, the harmony that is never resolved, the silence between verses that gives the song its shape but not its voice. Orpheus's music, so powerful, so persuasive, cannot restore her voice. It can only mourn its absence. In art, Eurydice is depicted trailing behind Orpheus, her hand reaching, her face obscured, her presence implied. She is often rendered smaller, dimmer, less defined. The moment of turning is captured with dramatic tension, but her expression is unreadable, her posture ambiguous, her voice, as ever, absent. And so Eurydice remains, not as a character but as a silence, not as a partner but as a shadow, not as a voice but as a vanishing. She is remembered, but not known. She is mourned but not heard. She is central but peripheral. In this way, Eurydice is not unlike Echo or Leda or Pandora. Each begins with presence. Each ends with silence. Each is interpreted, reinterpreted, reframed. Each becomes a symbol, simple, enduring, quietly exhausting. And so, we continue, not with dialogue, but with disappearance. The path fades, the scholars speculate, the silence deepens, and Eurydice, as ever, remains quietly unheard. Demeter, goddess of grain, of harvest, of the quiet miracle of seasonal repetition, was not known for spectacle, nor for wrath, nor for the kind of mythic interventions that require thunder or transformation. She was known for patience, for cultivation, for the slow, deliberate rhythm of growth and decay, and for her devotion to Persephone, her daughter, her companion, her seasonal counterpart. Their bond, described in fragments and hymns, and the kind of poetic shorthand that resists chronology, was not dramatic, but foundational, woven into the soil, into the calendar, into the mythic infrastructure of time itself. Persephone, young and radiant and mythically vulnerable, was gathering flowers, narcissus, crocus, hyacinth, and other blooms, whose names have been catalogued with the kind of botanical precision that suggests both reverence and foreshadowing, when the earth opened, not metaphorically, but literally, and Hades emerged, not as a villain, but as a narrative inevitability. He took her, or invited her, or claimed her, depending on the source and the interpretive generosity of the translator, and she descended into the underworld, not with protest, but with absence. Demeter searched, she wandered, she asked, she waited. Her grief, unlike Orpheus's, was not lyrical but agricultural. She did not sing, she did not descend, she did not negotiate, she withdrew, she withheld. She allowed the fields to wither, the grain to rot, the seasons to stall. Her sorrow became famine, not out of vengeance but out of inertia. The world paused, not because she demanded it, but because she could not continue. This withdrawal, described in the Homeric hymn to Demeter with the kind of slow, deliberate pacing that feels like winter settling into the bones of a myth, has been interpreted as both maternal devotion and divine protest. Demeter does not rage, she does not destroy, she waits, she mourns, she refuses to resume the rhythm of fertility until Persephone is returned, not in full, but in part, not permanently, but seasonally. The compromise, when it arrives, is agricultural. Persephone will return for part of the year, spring and summer, the months of growth and abundance, and remain in the underworld for the rest, autumn and winter, the months of decay and dormancy. This arrangement, mythically elegant and botanically plausible, becomes the foundation of the seasonal cycle, the explanation for why the earth blooms and withers, not randomly, but rhythmically. In literary readings, Demeter becomes the embodiment of maternal endurance, of grief that does not resolve but transforms, of love that reshapes the calendar. She is not passive nor aggressive but persistent. Her sorrow is not loud but structural. In feminist readings, she is a figure of resistance, of agency, of refusal. She does not accept the loss. She does not normalize it. She alters the world to accommodate her grief. She demands seasonal justice. In agricultural readings, she is the metaphor for the land itself, responsive, cyclical, dependent on balance. Her myth becomes a mnemonic for planting, for harvesting, for waiting. In psychological readings, she is the parent who cannot let go, the caregiver whose identity is entwined with presence, the figure who mourns not just the absence but the change. And Persephone, whose role will be explored in the next section, becomes the hinge of the myth, the figure who moves between worlds, who divides time, who transforms absence into rhythm. In this way, Demeter is not unlike Orpheus, or Sisyphus, or Echo. Each begins with loss, each responds with structure, each is interpreted, reinterpreted, reframed. Each becomes a symbol, simple, enduring, quietly exhausting. And so we begin this chapter, not with bloom, but with waiting. The fields wither, the scholars annotate, the seasons pause. And Demeter, as ever, remains quietly unresolved. Persephone, whose name carries the weight of seasonal rhythm, and whose myth has been folded into the architecture of time itself, occupies a liminal space in the Greek imagination, not simply as a daughter, nor merely as a queen, but as a figure suspended between worlds, between roles, between interpretations, her presence divided not by choice but by compromise, her identity shaped not by action, but by absence and return. She is taken, or chosen, or claimed, depending on the version, and her descent into the underworld is described with the kind of poetic ambiguity that allows for both abduction and initiation, both victimhood and transformation, both grief and inevitability. The earliest sources, particularly the Homeric hymn to Demeter, do not resolve this ambiguity. Instead, they preserve it, allowing Persephone to remain both the lost child and the emerging queen, both the reason for Demeter's sorrow and the embodiment of seasonal renewal. She eats the pomegranate seeds, 6 or 4, or perhaps just 1, depending on the poet's appetite for symbolism, and in doing so, she binds herself to the underworld, not permanently, but rhythmically, her presence now governed by a calendar that is less agricultural than emotional, less mythic than maternal. Her return each spring is not triumphant, nor dramatic, nor even particularly celebratory. It is quiet, cyclical, expected, a gesture of restoration that does not erase the absence but simply pauses it. She emerges from the underworld, not as a rescued figure, but as a returning one, her gaze no longer childlike, her role no longer singular. She is now Persephone of two realms, daughter of Demeter, queen of Hades, a figure whose duality has prompted centuries of interpretive labor, each reading attempting to reconcile the contradiction without resolving it. In literary readings, Persephone becomes the hinge of the myth, the pivot between growth and decay, between light and shadow, between presence and absence. She is not the protagonist, nor the antagonist, but the axis around which the story turns, her movement shaping the rhythm of the world without ever fully belonging to it. In feminist reading, she is both silenced and empowered, both taken and enthroned, both erased and central. Her descent is read as violation, her reign as reclamation, her seasonal rhythm as a metaphor for the cyclical nature of female agency in patriarchal narratives. Visible, then invisible, then visible again, never fully autonomous, never fully absent. In psychological readings, Persephone becomes the archetype of transformation, of individuation, of the journey into the unconscious. Her descent is the confrontation with shadow, her return the integration of self. She is not lost, but changed. Not broken, but redefined. In agricultural readings, she is the seed itself, buried, dormant, then blooming. Her myth becomes a mnemonic for planting, for waiting, for trusting the soil to remember what it holds. In philosophical readings, she is the embodiment of compromise, of duality, of the impossibility of singular identity. She is both here and not here, both above and below, both myth and metaphor. And in ritual she becomes the calendar, her movement marks the seasons. Her absence explains the cold, her return justifies the bloom. She is not worshipped for her power, but for her rhythm. In art, Persephone is depicted with flowers, with fruit, with shadows. She is often shown beside Demeter, or beside Hades, her posture ambiguous, her expression unreadable. She is crowned, but not triumphant. She is central, but not dominant. She is present, but not permanent. And so Persephone remains, not as a resolution, but as a rhythm, not as a character, but as a cycle, not as a voice, but as a turning. In this way, she is not unlike Echo, or Eurydice, or Ariadne. Each begins with presence, each ends with movement, each is interpreted, reinterpreted, reframed. Each becomes a symbol, simple, enduring, quietly exhausting. And so, we continue, not with bloom, but with return. The soil softens, the scholars annotate, the seasons resume, and Persephone, as ever, remains quietly divided. Hephaestus, god of fire, of metalwork, of the slow, deliberate transformation of raw material into form, was not born into Olympus with celebration, nor welcomed with garlands, nor admired for his divine lineage. He was born, according to one version of the myth, misshapen, imperfect, or simply inconvenient, and Hera, his mother, queen of the gods and patron of marriage, rejected him, not with fury but with silence, not with punishment, but with removal. She cast him from Olympus, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but physically, and he fell, not briefly, not dramatically, but for an entire day, through clouds, through air, through the mythic architecture of rejection. He landed eventually on the island of Lemnos, or perhaps in the sea, or perhaps in a version of the world that allowed for divine survival without divine welcome, and there, broken or bruised or simply alone, he began to work, not to conquer, not to persuade, not to reclaim his place, but to craft. He built his forge, his tools, his assistants, automata of gold and bronze, mechanical figures, whose existence has prompted centuries of scholarly speculation about ancient robotics and mythic engineering, and he began to shape the world, not with thunder, not with decree, but with heat, with metal, with rhythm. This fall, described in fragments and retellings and the kind of poetic shorthand that resists anatomical precision, has been interpreted as both literal and symbolic, both divine punishment and mythic metaphor. Hephaestus does not rage, he does not retaliate. He begins again, not with vengeance, but with craftsmanship. His forge becomes his voice, his creations become his presence. His labor becomes his myth. In literary readings, Hephaestus is the outsider god, the one who does not fit, who is not admired, who is not central to the dramas of Olympus but who enables them. Building the thrones, the weapons, the chains, the traps, the tools that allow other gods to perform their stories. He is not the protagonist, but the craftsman behind the curtain, the figure whose work shapes the stage, but whose name is rarely in the chorus. In philosophical readings, his fall becomes the metaphor for rejection, for exile, for the transformation of pain into productivity. He is cast out, but he does not disappear. He is wounded, but he does not stop. He is forgotten, but he becomes indispensable. In psychological readings, Hephaestus is the archetype of the wounded creator, the figure whose trauma becomes technique, whose isolation becomes mastery, whose silence becomes structure. He does not speak often in myth, but his creations speak for him, intricate, functional, enduring. In feminist readings, his rejection by Hera is examined not as maternal cruelty, but as mythic commentary on perfection, on divine aesthetics, on the intolerance of difference. Hephaestus's body, described as lame or twisted, or simply unideal, becomes the reason for his exile, and his work becomes the rebuttal. In technological readings, Hephaestus is the god of innovation, of design, of the slow, deliberate process of making something that works. His automata, golden servants, self-moving tripods, mechanical wonders, are described with the kind of detail that suggests both awe and confusion, and scholars have debated whether these descriptions reflect ancient dreams of robotics, or simply poetic exaggeration. And in artistic readings, Hephaestus is the hand behind the beauty, the fire beneath the form, the rhythm beneath the myth. He does not appear in many scenes, but his work is everywhere, on shields, on armor, on thrones, on traps. He is the god of what lasts. In this way, Hephaestus is not unlike Sisyphus or Echo or Demeter. Each begins with rejection, each responds with rhythm, each is interpreted, reinterpreted, reframed. Each becomes a symbol, simple, enduring, quietly exhausting. And so we begin this chapter, not with fire but with falling. The forge glows, the scholars speculate, the tools hum. And Hephaestus, as ever, remains quietly indispensable. The forge of Hephaestus, nestled in mythic geography that shifts depending on the poet's preference for volcanic symbolism, sometimes on Lemnos, sometimes beneath Mount Etna, sometimes deep within the architectural folds of Olympus itself, is not merely a workplace nor a sanctuary nor even a divine atelier, but a space of transformation, of rhythm, of persistence, where heat is not destructive but generative, and where the act of creation is not a moment but a process, slow and deliberate and endlessly repeated. It is here, in the glow of fire that does not consume but refines, that Hephaestus becomes not just a god, but a figure of mythic labor, shaping metal not for beauty alone, but for function, for consequence, for story. His tools, described in fragments and hymns and the kind of poetic shorthand that resists mechanical specificity, are not magical in the conventional sense. They do not sparkle, they do not speak, they do not defy physics, but they are precise, enduring, and quietly miraculous. His bellows move on their own. His hammers strike with rhythm that suggests both autonomy and obedience. And his assistants, crafted from gold, animated by divine ingenuity, and described with a blend of awe and confusion, serve not as servants but as extensions of his will, his silence, his craft. These automata, often overlooked in broader mythic narratives, have prompted centuries of scholarly speculation about ancient conceptions of artificial life, of mechanical agency, of the boundary between tool and being. Hephaestus does not speak often in myth, and when he does, it is usually to explain a mechanism, to offer a solution, to present a creation that will resolve a conflict he did not cause. He is summoned, not celebrated. He is needed, not admired. His forge is not a place of worship but of utility. And yet, it is in this space, this rhythmic, glowing, hammer-struck space, that he becomes indispensable, not because he demands attention, but because he enables resolution. In literary readings, the forge becomes a metaphor for endurance, for transformation, for the slow, deliberate shaping of identity through repetition. Hephaestus does not conquer, does not seduce, does not command. He crafts, he builds, he repairs. His myth is not about ascent, but about persistence. In philosophical readings, the forge is the site of becoming, of process over product, of labor as meaning. The fire does not destroy, it reveals. The metal does not resist, it responds. The god does not dominate, he endures. In psychological readings, the forge is the mind, heated, pressured, shaped by experience. Hephaestus becomes the archetype of the wounded creator, the figure whose trauma becomes technique, whose exile becomes mastery, whose silence becomes structure. In feminist readings, the forge is a counterpoint to the spectacle of Olympus, a space of quiet power, of uncelebrated skill, of creation without conquest. Hephaestus, rejected for his form, becomes central through his function. In technological readings, the forge is proto-industrial, a mythic precursor to design labs and machine shops, a space where divine intention meets mechanical precision. His automata, his tripods, his self-moving devices are not fantasy, they are blueprints for wonder. And in artistic readings, the forge is the origin of mythic beauty, not the beauty of form alone but of function, of durability, of the kind of aesthetic that emerges from necessity. Hephaestus does not decorate, he constructs. His shields tell stories, his chains hold gods, his thrones shape rule. In this way, the forge is not unlike the labyrinth, the jar, the thread, the stone. It is a mythic mechanism, simple, symbolic, endlessly interpreted. It does not sparkle, it glows. It does not speak, it hums. It does not resolve, it endures. And so, we continue, not with fire, but with rhythm. The bellows breathe. The scholars annotate, the metal cools. And Hephaestus, as ever, remains quietly essential. Hephaestus, whose forge glowed not with spectacle but with persistence, was rarely the center of mythic drama, yet his presence was felt in nearly every resolution, every trap, every throne, every object that allowed the gods to perform their stories with grandeur and consequence. He did not command storms, nor seduce mortals, nor hurl lightning from the sky. Instead, he built the mechanisms that made those gestures possible, crafting with the kind of quiet precision that resists celebration, but demands respect. When the gods broke things, relationships, promises, bodies, boundaries, it was Hephaestus who repaired them, not with magic, but with metal, not with decree, but with design. His role, described in fragments and footnotes, and the kind of poetic shorthand that often forgets to name the craftsman, was not glamorous, but essential. He built the golden net that trapped Aphrodite and Ares in their affair, not out of jealousy, but out of necessity, a device so intricate and invisible that it held them fast until the gods could gather and gawk. He forged Achilles' shield, a masterpiece of narrative compression, depicting not just battle but city, harvest, dance and cosmos, a circular poem rendered in bronze. He constructed the throne that bound Hera, his own mother, in a trap so elegant that only Dionysus, with wine and persuasion, could coax him back to Olympus to release her. These creations, described with varying degrees of detail and interpretive generosity, have prompted centuries of scholarly admiration, not for their symbolism alone, but for their function, for the way they resolve tension, restore order, and allow myth to continue. Hephaestus does not interrupt the story, he enables its next chapter. His work is not loud but lasting. In literary readings, Hephaestus becomes the figure of repair, of restoration, of the kind of divine labor that does not seek applause but simply refuses to stop. He is not the hero, nor the villain, nor the lover, nor the trickster. He is the one who returns to the forge when the story breaks. In philosophical readings, his craftsmanship becomes a metaphor for resilience, for the transformation of rejection into rhythm, for the quiet dignity of making what others need but do not understand. He is not admired for his beauty, nor for his power, but for his endurance. In psychological readings, Hephaestus is the archetype of the wounded healer, the figure whose pain becomes skill, whose exile becomes mastery, whose silence becomes structure. He does not speak often, but his work speaks always. In feminist readings, his labor becomes a counterpoint to divine spectacle, a reminder that creation is not conquest, that beauty is not dominance, that utility is not weakness. Hephaestus, rejected for his form, becomes central through his function. In technological readings, he is the mythic engineer, the divine designer, the patron of innovation. His automata, his self-moving tripods, his golden assistants are not fantasy. They are blueprints for wonder, for the dream of machines that serve without complaint, that move without fatigue, that endure without applause. And in artistic readings, Hephaestus is the hand behind the myth, the one who shapes the shield, who binds the throne, who crafts the chain, who builds the stage. He is not the actor but the architect. In this way, Hephaestus is not unlike Sisyphus or Echo or Demeter. Each begins with absence, each responds with rhythm. Each is interpreted, reinterpreted, reframed. Each becomes a symbol, simple, enduring, quietly exhausting. And so we close this chapter, not with fire, but with form. The forge cools, the scholars annotate, the tools rest, and Hephaestus, as ever, remains quietly indispensable. Theseus, often described as a hero, though the term itself becomes increasingly unstable under scholarly scrutiny, did not defeat the Minotaur through brute strength alone, nor through divine intervention, nor through the kind of mythic cleverness that emerges spontaneously in moments of crisis. He succeeded rather because someone else, Ariadne, daughter of King Minos, inhabitant of Crete, and occasional narrative accessory, gave him a thread. Not a sword, not a spell, not a map, but a thread, simple, linear, unassuming, and quietly revolutionary. The labyrinth, designed by Daedalus with the kind of architectural precision that resists both escape and interpretation, was not merely a maze, nor a prison, nor a metaphor for confusion, but a structure so deliberately complex that it required not strength, but memory, not courage, but continuity. Theseus entered, not alone, but tethered, his path marked not by instinct, but by string, a line that would guide him back, not forward, a solution that did not defeat the monster, but defeated the maze. This gesture, Ariadne handing him the thread, has prompted centuries of interpretive labor, not because it is dramatic, but because it is quiet, because it shifts the locus of cleverness away from the hero and toward the helper, the woman, the figure who is often forgotten once the monster is slain. Theseus kills the Minotaur, yes, but the thread is what allows him to leave, and the thread is not his idea. In literary readings, the thread becomes the true hero of the myth, a symbol of continuity, of foresight, of the kind of intelligence that does not announce itself with speeches or swords, but with preparation. Theseus, in this reading, is not clever. He is guided. In feminist readings, Ariadne becomes the architect of success, the figure whose contribution is erased once the story resumes its masculine rhythm. She is not celebrated. She is abandoned, left on Naxos, depending on the version, depending on the poet's appetite for cruelty or divine intervention. Her thread remains, but her presence fades. In philosophical readings, the labyrinth is the mind, the thread is reason, the Minotaur is fear, and Theseus is the self navigating its own complexity. The myth becomes a meditation on identity, on memory, on the necessity of structure. In psychological readings, the thread is the coping mechanism, the ritual, the habit that allows one to return from the depths. Theseus does not conquer the labyrinth, he survives it, and survival in this reading is not triumph, but technique. In architectural readings, Daedalus becomes the true protagonist, the designer of confusion, the engineer of containment, the figure whose creation resists resolution. The labyrinth is not a place to escape, it is a place to endure. And in artistic readings, the thread is the line, the gesture, the mark that transforms chaos into pattern. It is not decorative, it is directional. It does not embellish, it guides. In this way, the thread is not unlike the jar, the stone, the olive tree, the forge. It is a mythic mechanism, simple, symbolic, endlessly interpreted. It does not sparkle, it stretches, it does not speak, it connects, it does not resolve, it returns. And so, we begin this chapter, not with heroism, but with navigation. The thread unspools, the scholars annotate, the maze remains. And Theseus, as ever, remains quietly guided. The labyrinth, designed by Daedalus with the kind of obsessive precision that suggests both genius and exhaustion, was not merely a prison for the Minotaur, nor a test for Theseus, nor a metaphor for confusion, but a structure so deliberately complex, so spatially recursive, so narratively charged, that it became a character in its own right, a place that did not simply contain but remembered, that did not merely challenge but absorbed, that did not resolve but repeated. It was not a maze in the modern sense, with hedges or puzzles or cheerful signage. It was a mythic architecture of containment, a space built to hold contradiction, to delay resolution, to resist escape. Daedalus, whose name is often invoked with admiration but rarely examined with empathy, did not build the labyrinth as an act of cruelty, nor as a punishment, nor even as a solution to a problem, but as a response to a command, a royal directive from King Minos, who needed a place to hide the consequence of his own broken promise. The Minotaur, born of divine insult and human error, was not a monster in the conventional sense, but a creature of mythic inconvenience, a being whose existence required containment, not confrontation. The labyrinth was not built to kill, it was built to hold. and hold it did. The structure, described in fragments and footnotes, and the kind of poetic shorthand that resists cartography, was said to be so intricate that even Daedalus himself could barely navigate it without assistance. It twisted, it folded, it looped. It did not lead, it lingered. It did not confuse, it remembered. Every turn was a repetition. Every corridor was a hesitation. Every exit was a lie. Theseus entered, not to explore, but to eliminate. He came with a sword, yes, but more importantly, with a thread. A line of continuity, of memory, of borrowed cleverness. He did not solve the maze. He bypassed it. He did not understand the structure, he escaped it. And in doing so, he left the labyrinth intact, unresolved, still waiting. In literary readings, the labyrinth becomes the metaphor for narrative itself, a structure that resists climax, that delays resolution, that loops back on itself with the kind of quiet insistence that feels like mythic déjà vu. It is not a place to conquer, it is a place to endure. In philosophical readings, the maze is the mind, the self, the system. It is the structure we build to contain what we cannot face. The minotaur is the shadow. The thread is reason. The exit is compromise. In psychological readings, the labyrinth is trauma, repetitive, enclosing, difficult to navigate without guidance. Theseus does not heal the maze. He leaves it. The minotaur is slain, but the structure remains. In architectural readings, Daedalus becomes the mythic engineer, the designer of containment, the figure whose brilliance is both admired and feared. His maze is not a failure. It is a success so complete that it resists its own undoing. And in artistic readings, the labyrinth is the line, the gesture, the repetition, that gives form to confusion. It is not decorative, it is deliberate. It does not embellish, it encloses. In this way, the maze is not unlike the forge, the jar, the thread, the stone. It is a mythic mechanism, simple, symbolic, endlessly interpreted. It does not resolve. It repeats. It does not forget. It remembers. And so, we continue, not with escape, but with structure. The corridors twist. The scholars annotate. The thread unspools. And the labyrinth, as ever, remains quietly intact. And that's where we leave it. The myths have been told, or at least murmured. The gods have wandered off, mostly unbothered. The thread has gone slack. The labyrinth is quiet. Even the scholars have stopped annotating, for now. If you're still awake, you don't need to be. There's nothing left to resolve. No monsters, no bargains, no turning back. Just a soft hush, a slow breath, and the gentle weight of stories that don't mind being unfinished. Sleep well.